Hey, since we recorded this episode, the last few weeks have been eventful in the news, to say the least. From Charlie Kirk's assassination to moves by the Trump administration in reaction, the FCC's intervention around Jimmy Kimmel, for example. These recent events tie into the theme of today's episode in ways we couldn't have expected. Like everything with Trump, the political analysis of this is that these are unprecedented stages in an authoritarian takeover, and recent polling does show concern about Trump overreaching. But after years of end of democracy alarms by a political class that doesn't intend to expand democracy itself, many are going to tune this out. No doubt, Trump's latest moves are hypocritical for an administration that claims to champion free speech, but we've seen similar pressures before, including from the Biden administration as they worked behind the scenes to censor content online. And this irony goes to the heart of our discussion. Can a political class that has spent years undermining democratic rights suddenly incredibly pose as democracy's savior? Or does the ongoing failure of Trump's opposition only prove the opposite? Keep that in mind as you listen. We think it only sharpens the arguments in this episode. Thanks.
Welcome to the Ramble Report. I'm Grant.
And I'm Joe.
We're back after summer break or summer chaos. Take your pick.
Yeah, there was almost an episode where I'm wearing an eye patch, or I would be wearing an eye patch. We'll just leave it at that.
Today's episode, we want to talk to you about democracy.
It's a very fundamental question.
You can take the word for granted a bit because you hear democracy as a rallying cry all the time in politics now, from the establishment parties and their opponents alike. But they're talking about different things in a sense. You can feel that. For the political class, defending democracy is about defending institutions. Populists, other challengers are invoking something closer to old ideas of representing the will of the people.
Allegedly. But the way democracy used to work is more complicated than just the will of the people. But first, what is democracy? Why can't the political class defend democracy?
We'll go through articles by Irish scholar Peter Mair, who we've talked about on the show before. We'll also speak about an Australian writer on anti-politics who went by the Piping Shrike. And lastly, we'll look at ideas from someone who's experienced the limits of the pro-democracy center of politics up close, an American writer, Evelyn Quartz. Just to get us started, how did the word democracy itself change in meaning at the turn of the 21st century?
Well, Peter Mair's book, Ruling the Void, is very helpful here, isn't it? And we've talked about that previously. We spent a whole episode on this. How he explains the decline of political participation and how the political parties reacted to not being grounded in social institutions outside of themselves. But there's another part of the book we want to focus on. Mair talks about how as people's engagement in politics decreased, especially visible by the 1990s, scholars started talking about democracy. Now, you could argue this is to save democracy, but there's one problem. They weren't interested in getting people back involved. It was more about redefining democracy itself. How do they make democracy, which was traditionally defined by the people exercising popular will through elections, make sense as fewer people trust in politics or participate in political groups?
Right. Mair sets out an equation for what Western democracy comes to be known for. Civil society plus political parties plus judges equals democracy. He highlights that this constitutional aspect of democracy and mass participation were once seen as complementary, at least in the way that the West conceptualized itself, but then they're being increasingly disaggregated and contrasted with one another. You have thinkers saying that democracy is too precious to be left to elections, for example. And this constitutional liberalism with strong courts and constrained majorities is the Western model of democracy as it's conceptualized today. Elections, they're seen as messy, potentially illiberal, right? What if society chooses the wrong thing? While institutions are these reliable bulwarks against the barbarians at the gates, especially with populism.
Right. I mean, we saw that with the recent nullification of Georgescu in Romania. Kalen Georgescu was running last year for president of Romania. And he was seen as a sort of kooky, loose cannon, anti-NATO, right-wing populist. But he wins the election. The Constitutional Court of Romania decides to know the results. And when he tries to run in the next election, they bar him. So you're seeing here the judicial system intervening on the democratic process in a very transparent way. That gets to Mair himself, who argues that the surge in democracy talk was, quote, not intended to open up or reinvigorate democracy. The aim is rather to redefine democracy so it can cope with the decline of popular engagement. It is a wide-ranging attempt to define democracy in a way that does not require substantial emphasis on popular sovereignty. At the extreme, the projection of a kind of democracy without the demos at its center. Now, granted, Mair is writing this more than 15 years ago now, and you can probably update that with it's less about a decline in popular engagement than popular engagement comes back, but in a way that's disruptive.
Your example of Georgescu makes a lot of sense. Also, just through the 2010s, Peter Mair died in 2011, unfortunately. But through the 2010s, you had these disruptive interventions into politics, which Peter Mair documented the apathetic, seemingly apathetic stance of the public towards politics in the 90s and the early 2000s. You get this upsurge, but it's not the kind of rejuvenation of democracy that I think democracy scholars, or however you'd frame them, were looking for.
No, it wasn't. It's not that populism didn't exist, during Mair's time either, but it's more the more substantial meltdown of the party systems that we saw throughout Western democracies.
Well, and actually, too, that goes to how anti-politics isn't just populism. The anti-political things that Mair did see took on more of a technocratic veneer, right? So you had figures like Obama who did actually crusade against the way things worked, the old political class, the elite in Washington, but did it in a more of a technocratic, good government way that goes back to, say, Jimmy Carter in the US tradition. It becomes more clear with Trump, Brexit, that kind of manifestation of it. But also even things like 15M in Spain that people would probably consider more progressive, so to speak, or the yellow vests in France, that there is this apathy that Mair was observing was maybe all along a hostility towards politics.
Maybe the difference was that it moved from more passive to more active.
And so that raises the question of how would he react to these upswings of hostile interest in politics?
Well, one of the bloggers that we are covering now, the Piping Shrike, I think he actually wound up picking up where Mair was leaving off in many ways, in terms of the substantial meltdown of the political class in the West in the 2010s. And he would agree with Mair that parties used to represent distinct organized social groups, unions, farmers, churches, etc.
Right. He observes that mainstream parties now claim to represent society as a whole through the composition of the party, rather than representing any specific interest or a social group.
Right. I think for Shrike, he is noting that the transition from 20th century politics to 21st century politics is about the transition from representative democracy to what he calls political democracy.
That's very similar to what Mair's talking about, really, that institutional legalism. What Shrike captures is that the parties don't just see human rights, constitutions, liberalism as the meaning of democracy. They actually begin to see themselves as the meaning of democracy, maybe even over those things by the time we hit the late 2010s. As this shift takes place, parties start to treat attacks on themselves as attacks on democracy.
Here's a great quote from one of his articles. Any Democrat would surely welcome the upheaval from recent elections and referendums as a sign that voters are at last starting to impact and reshape a political system that has had declining appeal to them for several decades. So he's getting at Mair on declining turnout as we saw from the 70s to the 2000s. Going back to Shrike, though, yet the upheaval has been greeted with alarm across politics and media. After the initial shock in 2016 subsided, this alarm is now starting to emerge as a more coherent response from the political classes.
He even goes on, too, to talk about that response, saying, since the decline of unloved political parties and political classes is unlikely to generate much sympathy, This alarm has tended to be expressed as a concern about broader threats to democratic procedures and institutions. Conversely, an attempt to lay the blame at the feet of voters is being dressed up as concern about their vulnerability to mind control from dark external forces. So that, at the time, you could think of how Trump's election was blamed on Russian bots and this kind of thing. I mean, Bernie Sanders was accused of being floated by Russia. People forget about that. This idea of these dark external forces are what's driving populists or anti-politicians and things like that.
Yeah, or even a sort of heavy moralizing and pathologizing of the public at large.
Well, you see it more recently, though, with stuff like social media bans, right? Recently, Nepal had social media bans because in Nepal, there was this trending hashtag about Nepo babies. And it wasn't really the same as in the US. We talk about Nepo babies like Hollywood stars and their children getting roles. In Nepal, they used the term Nepo babies to refer to the children of politicians and to politicians themselves and the lavish lifestyle that people were seeing political figures leading there. And so, very conveniently, social media bans start coming in around the time that the youth are getting very upset about political privileges in Nepal. Well, that didn't go well. You obviously have these protests. This is something we'll probably get into later because it is a complicated issue. But you see, eventually, sort of the inversion of banning social media is that the Nepalese protesters organize an election on Discord to choose the interim prime minister. The point here being that you've seen across the political spectrum now this accusation that anything that threatens the establishment is another country's election interference or kind of ideological control by dark forces like fascism or communism or something along those lines.
Going back to Shrike, too, he raised an interesting example on the Australian referendum on same-sex marriage. The referendum itself was opposed by many progressives, and then the vote happens, and it delivered a success for same-sex marriage. And this after progressive groups actually campaigned against the vote happening at all. I think there are echoes of this attempt to prevent democracy from even taking place because of potential for messy results weren't wanted. So, like, you had these attempts to overturn or stymie Brexit after the vote. It took 3 years for that to even happen. And it had to be forced through by Boris Johnson running on a campaign to get Brexit done once and for all and sort of forced the result on not just Parliament, but even a large section of his own political party.
Right. So, as you said, you had these progressives who assumed the worst of people, and then the vote happened and actually delivered a pro same sex marriage result from the public in Australia. Quite an ironic sort of turn of events. Shrike, commenting on sort of these things in general, writes, "This leaves Democrats with something of a dilemma. The mobilization of Parliament to overturn or prevent a democratic vote means pitching against the will of the public, the only real democratic institution the public has. It poses as much a dilemma for the British public that voted for parliamentary sovereignty in Brexit, only to find the same parliamentary sovereignty being used to override it, just as it does for an Australian minority facing a supposed tyranny of the majority that for more than a decade supported its cause, and instead forced to turn to a parliament that consistently showed it did not." So I think he captures a really great irony there at the end too. Right? You have an Australian minority, gay people, facing the supposed tyranny of the majority, the wider society, the wider public, that actually that wider public supported it. And it's supposed to get represented by a parliament that kept dragging its heels on gay marriage.
It is quite funny, really, that the Labour Party itself in Australia was opposing this referendum.
The majority opinion was both there should be a vote and that there should be same-sex marriage. And so there was a very clear and there was a very obvious way, if you supported same-sex marriage, to get same-sex marriage. But because the vote, so to be fair too, the entire idea of a referendum came out of all these political games. The center-right Liberal Party had come up with the idea of a same-sex marriage vote to try and do some internal tactical things, right? So it was initially the right that had come up with the idea for a vote, but then it would work. And Labor, instead of pressing the advantage on this, opposed the referendum to pressure the right wing that was calling for it.
It is a classic example of a social interest being subordinated to political interest, isn't it?
Right. It just became a political football for a long time, and nobody really wanted to resolve it.
The public
And Labor had been in power several times and had the ability to take action on same-sex marriage. But then they all became pro same-sex marriage while out of power, of course.
Here is a good quote from Shrike. Perhaps one way to resolve this is to recall what is the real democratic content of Parliament and the political parties. Unfortunately, it seems much of this understanding of democracy has been lost. Several decades of declining public interest in existing political institutions has obscured that it was the public that gave political parties and the institutions that they operate their democratic content. This lost understanding applies not just to the established parties. As the discussion around the same-sex marriage vote showed, it also applies to previously progressive social movements that now see the public as a tyrant rather than the path to emancipation.
I think this is a global thing. I think around the world, progressives have become less and less majoritarian. They are less interested in winning the social battle, so to speak, which doesn't allow society to metabolize these issues properly.
You know, this is something I've wondered about actually in the context of you don't really see left-wing populists talk too much about expanding democracy or holding the political class to more democratic accountability. They might talk about getting the influence of money out of politics. And that is maybe how they talk about people power in the abstract. It's not in the sense of, I don't know, term limits, recallability, that type of thing. But anything that would give the public more of a disciplinary mechanism over the political class, or more power for themselves.
Which sort of gets at how we could be nostalgic for the old political forms of representation, but even that was very limited, right? That was a compromise that society made with politics, and it was a place where society, through that representation, also gave up a certain amount of power. And even when we're thinking about this, to me, it's not about being nostalgic for the old form of representation, even though obviously we have some critiques of the institution focused one. But are there new forms of democracy in the future, right? It's up to society to decide and shape that.
Shrike also has this great article titled Unpopular Populists, where he talks about how he doesn't see the rise of populism as about the same things that the media and political class had. I think to Shrike, it's more about an unraveling of the old order.
And I just love that title, Unpopular Populism. It's such a catchy term that Shrike was using there. It really gets at how the populist uprising of sorts in recent years has not really come from a large conversion of the population to populist ideology necessarily. Instead, you just have opposition parties that are taking advantage of the challenge to the old order that they have an opportunity to make because politics is unraveling so much. You know, not having that grounding in society, sort of like falling through an open door for it, even without opposition. And so even if populists address certain issues around sovereignty that society finds salient, for example, in the case of Brexit, right, or generally in the case of Euroscepticism, European leaders tended to retreat into European Union institutions as a way of not being accountable to their electorate. But that doesn't mean that everybody's a populist all of a sudden.
Fear of populism has really defined a lot of American politics on the left and on the center in recent years. We did find an interesting critic from the inside. There's a writer named Evelyn Quartz who worked with the Lincoln Project, but has a more left-wing social democratic perspective for herself. She has a Substack and has written interesting things for the magazine Compact.
Yeah, she has some very telling stories about the inside of the anti-Trump resistance that has held together a lot of strange bedfellows in American politics since 2016. You know, and years later today, it seems like that resistance is really what's preventing the Democrats from coming up with a coherent response to their own deeper structural issues. You know, it holds this unstable coalition of leftists, centrists, Liz Cheney types together through this idea of saving democracy, really as Mair would describe it, saving institutional democracy, political democracy.
Right. Quartz observes that in her meetings about saving democracy, her colleagues would focus obsessively on messaging while really never mentioning labor, inequality, or redistribution. She laments that voters are, quote, spoken about, never with.
Yeah, the way she points it out the entire time that they're trying to deal with Trump, internally, these conversations are about the Democratic Party's brand. They're about the messaging. They're not really about the content, right? And so solving problems, solving social problems, putting something forward is secondary. And of course, you've got a coalition of anti-Trump people who have very different ideas about what should be done concretely. Instead, it's just all how can we beat Trump through manipulating ideas properly? And you can hear from, you were quoting Quartz a little bit there, you can hear that she takes that kind of left-wing perspective on it, right? Why aren't you talking about the deeper economic issues that led to the rise of Trump? It is an interesting point that nobody in that room was really talking about the material realities of things.
Quartz argues that the political class is nostalgic for an order in which institutional actors, police discourse and voters behaved as expected, which is true. There was more control over things in the past from the top. So they mourned that legitimacy that eroded. But I think Quartz has this perspective it's more economistic than I think ours would be. Because she would see it as, both parties embracing financialization, the gutting of labor, the disengagement of citizens from political life. And I don't know if I see that as something that was completely determined from the political elite.
I think there's an episode about neoliberalism that we need to do.
You always said about it coming back too. I don't know what it means anymore.
But she does have this very memorable line that voters are spoken about, never with. The professional center can't save democracy because it views itself and its institutions as being democracy itself. And she points out it won't solve social issues. I think we'd argue it can't solve social issues.
And maybe that gets to something I've been thinking of too. Going back to our question at the beginning of the episode, why can't the political class save democracy? And I think it's because it's not really up to them to say. If democracy is the sovereignty of the people, it's up to the people to save democracy. Democracy rests in their hands. Election. The fact that these institutions are trying to invert democracy into being about themselves.
I think this also gets at where I see the limits of a purely economic critique of the anti-Trump resistance. It's not just about inequality, though I do think we should talk about cost of living is a very consistent issue that anti-politicians can hammer quite well. And we should talk about the reasons why someday.
Getting back to what I was saying on institutions too, they try to invert democracy into being about themselves. I mean, these are very weak institutions that really only penetrate an increasingly thin layer of society. So how can they save themselves from a public that's hostile, a public that is supposed to be democracy? It's a bit nonsensical when you think it is.
That actually, too, to me, gets at the Piping Shrike has a very interesting argument about identity politics, because I feel like most of the arguments are very kind of tedious. It's bad because it's woke type of things. Shrike is one of the people I've read who's gotten to the core issue of representation in identity politics and the way it works. Shrike argues, taking the idea of women politicians, for example, they're considered representative of women because they're women, but they aren't there representing any kind of women's organization that they have to be answerable to. They're not required to pursue a pro-women agenda in any kind of way, right? There's no obligation of a women politician to fix abortion laws or anything like that. I'll quote Shrike here. With no women's organization to answer to and no pressure to pursue a pro-women political agenda, in what ways then can women MPs be said to represent women? The only other way in the traditional sense is that women MPs represent women in general because they see the world the same way, which stretches into uncomfortable biological determinism of how women think. What we have here is the inversion of representation in the way it is traditionally understood, not a representative of a group in society that put her or him in place and so answerable to it, but as a political representative already in place and then claiming to represent a group in society by virtue of who they are. This is not only an inversion of what representation is supposed to be about, but arguably pretty unsatisfactory for women and men who would want to see something done about issues such as, say, restrictions on abortion. And that's from his article, Through the Looking Glass.
You know what it reminds me of too? Speaking of American politics, it reminds me of a lot of the arguments about the groups that is going around now. And you've heard about that, right? There's a lot of, I guess the Democrats are trying to scapegoat the groups as a problem for them. And I think by the groups, I mean NGOs, some of which revolve around identity politics. And there's a kind of a point in the sense that activist groups are not really representative in the traditional sense.
But more because they're highly politically active, not because they're women or LGBTQ.
Right. Which I don't think they quite understand. I think the way they understand it is that the public is reactionary, so we should not talk about these issues.
I mean, they basically think that the American public is a bunch of, I would say Homer Simpsons, but it's not like Homer Simpson. Homer Simpson is not racist. I'm not saying Homer Simpson is racist, but they think of the American public as a bunch of adults who just like sit around on the couch throwing their Budweisers at the TV every time a woman comes on screen. And I just don't think that's true. And it's not about what I think, actually. The empirical polling isn't there. I mean, I think we wanted to write an article a while back titled something like, "Is the public fascist or is the public reactionary?" And you can just look issue by issue by issue. And the public is either fairly moderate or socially liberalizing over time. But they blame the public. They always blame the public for the lack of progress, which is really, at their feet in many ways. Or, I mean, I didn't even want to make it a matter of individual responsibility on the part of politicians. I think what we're talking about is that there's material structural issues that they're trying to adapt to, that they can't. This all also goes back to Quartz. She says here, what replaced class politics was segmentation, targeting voters by lifestyle, race, education level, and consumer preference. The New Deal gave way to new data models. That legacy defines the limits of the pro-democracy center today. I think she is getting at something there as well. There's this desire to slice and dice the public through these identity abstractions. It's how you get these confused formulations as well of multiracial fascism or something like that to try and explain how Trump does well with Hispanic voters. If you just narrowly view people through these demographic lens, you're not actually democratically engaging them about what they think and what they want and who they really are as individuals or even as groups.
Here's a good quote from her too. Maintaining the center's preferred version of democracy requires excluding the very people who have lost faith in it. It requires filtering their anger to consultants, reducing their discontent to metrics, recasting their alienation as misinformed rather than earned, and continuing to treat redistribution, not authoritarianism, as a real threat to stability.
I think that's great. I really like that quote from Quartz.
I guess one thing I would have asked about too, though, isn't the center kind of authoritarian right now? Like, no, politics is not authoritarian.
Yeah, that's an interesting point, because she goes on to say, I'm not saying pro-democracy centrists are insincere. They still think politics is best handled by professionals, that voters are too volatile to trust, that power should circulate among a credentialed class. What about that isn't authoritarian at a certain point, right? Especially when you have the center willing to, I mean, Trump isn't the only person who contests election results anymore.
In general, the political class has become quite heavy and quite paranoid too.
You can see that, especially since COVID. A sort of empire strikes back thing with anti-politics in general.
I do like this quote too, though, because she says, like, right after that on the pro-democracy centrists, they walked away from a party, but not from a system that sees democracy as management.
Right. So I assume that's referring to GOP Trump exiles.
Right. I feel like your standard Democratic Politico sees democracy as management at this point.
I think this is one of the hardest things for political people to give up, is this sense of the public as, no matter how much empirical information you have in front of you, because the other side, quote unquote, wins sometimes, it's very difficult to see the public as having reasons behind what they're doing. And it's very easy to see the public as this dark, barbaric, savage force that democracy actually needs to be protected from.
The point was to ask, why can't the political class save democracy? It's up to the public.
So what is democracy? I don't think it's institutional democracy, where the center of communal life is constitutions, judges, legal processes. I also don't think that democracy is simply this representative system either. Even if we could say there was perhaps something more democratic in a sense about social groups organizing to secure their own representation, I think it all exists on a spectrum where democracy is ultimately about self-governance.
Do you think representative democracy was more democratic? I wonder about that myself, actually.
It's a good question.
A lot of those old parties weren't exactly internally democratic.
Right. Because I guess that also goes, do you define democracy and how democratic things are by the nature of the state? Or is it people's influence? Is it society's influence over government? Because you could almost argue that these anti-political times we're living in, where there are all these attempts to curb democracy, that things are more democratic in a weird way, because of the fact that instead of people being attached to mass politics and being drawn into things like world wars, you've got, through lack of participation in formal democracy, society exerting its own kind of influence over history.
I tend to think that myself, actually. It's all worth unpacking perhaps in another episode. But I think, too, something that's worth pointing out is when you think of all the ideological and political systems like fascism, communism, socialism, monarchy, the only thing that still seems to have any attraction among the public still is democracy. And I think it's because of there being a promise there, a promise that society can administer its own affairs.
Right, that we can govern ourselves. I agree with that. It is interesting. It's the thing that kind of carries that torch today. Whereas terms like communism or obviously things like fascism, the public is so non-ideological now. I mean, even when you get supposedly political kind of mass shooters and things like that, it's always the people who are ideological, and I'm not just talking about shooters, actually, the people who are ideological in our society are often very eclectic. They've got a weird grab bag of ideologies, really. And the people who are consistently ideologues for some faction in politics, even though they're quite loud, they're a pretty small fringe of the public or members of the political class itself. Democracy is one of the few unsullied words in politics left. You've lost technocracy. Technocracy used to mean something supposedly good. Our friend Anton wrote an article about the technocratic movement in the United States recently.
That was a little bit scary, to be honest, but
that was an interesting read. There's almost every ideological term that exists is so thoroughly corrupted that the public spits at it. And it's not like people are very happy with our democracy. But it is interesting that I think people would want a better democracy, probably.
I mean, democracy is one of the most abused words in the English language when you think about it. Think of social movements that have been like abused or turned into cliches. The civil rights, that's a great example, right? And yet, despite that, it never loses its draw. There's a promise of human reconciliation. There's a promise of having a power over the course of events. And nothing can really sully that. Even though these things played a role, it wasn't really about elections. It wasn't about courts, and it wasn't about institutions. I mean, all those things.
They're involved, of course.
They're involved. They're involved, of course.
The beating heart of it is the social movement.
Right. It's about a part of society forcing itself to be part of the rest of society.
Thanks for listening to this episode of the Rabble Report on democracy. We intend to continue exploring the subject and having other people on and discussing it with them. Thanks again for watching and being part of this.